San Francisco, the city by the bay. The city that always warrants our attention in these alternative explorations. There are many remnants in San Francisco, such as the Palace of Fine Arts. But is it the original palace? We're also fortunate that many of the great Capitol buildings still remain intact. Fortunate that you can explore these structures on the ground, that you can physically interface with them to ascertain the nature of their construction and their construction materials. Opera houses across the land. So many examples of structures that we can still explore. Many great cities with many remnants of these structures. But what about the structures that we've lost over time? The structures that are no longer with us? In this exploration, we're going to focus on these structures that we've lost, whether it's through urban renewal, the effects of conflict, or many other reasons. We're going to explore the story and examine how real these structures may have been as we explore the lost old world, the legacy of urban renewal. Come join me. We begin by looking at the legacy of urban renewal. In the United States, which did not experience the effects directly of World War I or World War II, there was the process of urban renewal, which in Cincinnati alone demolished 2,800 residential buildings. In the United States, one of the Housing Act's main initiatives was urban renewal. This was part of the New Fair Deal. It destroyed about 2,000 communities in the 1950s and the 60s. It forced more than 300,000 families from their homes. The point behind this was to resurrect America's cities, the same cities which had worked hard to build the American military machine in World War II. Yet there are many other examples across the land where, due to current political events or friction with non-governmental organizations or non-state actors as they're called, that many of these great structures have been lost, whether they're buildings or statues or carved out figures. But there's other explanations for what may have happened. It could simply be because these old structures really are falling apart and they represent a safety threat. Although when we start to look deeper into the story, we find that is very rarely the case. It's merely the stated case, that it's just simply easier to tear them down, that it's merely a process of true urban renewal. However, we have no shortage of examples of conflict, such as with this incredibly gorgeous church in Warsaw, Poland. And we're well aware of the conflicts that afflicted the lands during the particular time, looking at our official mainstream historical account. But we look closer at many of these structures and we cannot help but be awed by the incredible and intricate detail, the art that was expressed in them when they were originally constructed, which as we understand it was in the distant past. Many of these structures were constructed in the 1800s according to the official account, others in the early 1900s. It is very rare that we have a structure that's constructed after 1940, such as this very impressive structure in Melbourne, Australia. And yes, we will be exploring Australia very soon, because we can see the same details within this coffee palace, as it was called. A wondrous dome and portal windows. And again, the same exact detailings of architecture with impressive pediments, numerous columns, and even columns integrated into the wall. What exactly is it really made out of, though? A sandstone, a limestone, some sort of advanced polymer, or something else entirely beyond our understanding? We're not really sure. We even have examples such as this town in Germany, which represented the remnants of the Middle Ages, and yet it was completely destroyed by the effects of World War II. Is this really something representative of the Middle Ages? Or is it something else? Looking at this very impressive tower, you get the idea that it represented something of a more advanced construction capability. And we've explored many other examples. And yet going over to Florida near Jacksonville, we can see the effects of urban renewal. The United States was not affected by the destructive forces of World War I and World War II, and yet many of the structures in the United States that reflected the Old World, or what we define as the Old World, were lost over time as a process of this urban renewal. Even in Malta, this great royal opera house that was constructed in the early 1900s was demolished by a bomb hit from the German Air Force in World War II, the Luftwaffe. Even though we're informed that German Air Force didn't necessarily have the best strategic bombing capability, they still had the ability to drop bombs. What an incredible structure and what an unfortunate loss. And again, I'm wondering, what exactly was it constructed out of? This is the unfortunate reality we face when trying to ascertain the reality behind these structures. Yes, we have pictures, but what were they really made out of? Why is it they were demolished and others survived? And we have other strange structures, such as Sibley Breaker here in Philadelphia in the 1860s. Now, we understand that these structures had a function, whether it was for mining or whether it was to produce lead, although you might recall we've seen numerous shot towers that were certainly not constructed out of wood. Now, why is it that this particular building was constructed out of wood? Do I believe that this particular structure was beyond the capabilities of the people in the United States in the 1860s? No, not necessarily, but it is rather an odd structure, and it is rather unique in its layout. Could it be that it was inspired by something else? And why do we have these smokestacks? Why do we have these examples of these impressive structures by this very unique breaker, or whatever you want to call it? And oddly enough, numerous individuals that are posing for the picture. Or if you ever saw that episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000 where they reviewed the giant Gila monster, they called this technique blocking, where people were posing very specific for pictures. Back to Warsaw, Poland, where we see incredible structures, and we know the tragic story behind Poland, destroyed in World War II. Oddly enough, there's a lot of controversy that Poland was abandoned or ignored by the Allies, both at the start and at the end of World War II. Quite an interesting account that we have, and if you ever watch the film A Bridge Too Far, you'll see that that element of tension still makes its way into the film, specifically concerning Gene Hackman's character. But you can see that in Poland, which we've briefly looked at, we see examples of stunning architecture that you might not necessarily associate with traditional Eastern Europe, and yet it's there, or at least it was there until it was lost. And then going back to San Francisco with its very impressive City Hall that was, oddly enough, destroyed in a very geometrically precise way, it appears, and yes, I'm being facetious a little bit, by that earthquake in 1906, or as they call it, the series of disasters, because that's what it really was. And this was the City Hall, a City Hall that they went to great trouble constructing. And yet, oddly enough, we see strange things when we look closely at these images. Strange elements of debris, and what exactly are these? Burning barrels? Or are these barrels to pick up the debris? What exactly is going on in these images? And it should be noted that we do actually have video footage of San Francisco right after this earthquake hit. Very strange. Concerning San Francisco and the disaster of 1906, they call it that in the official account that you look at it. They don't just call it an earthquake, because it was an earthquake, it was a fire, and it was even the efforts, primarily by the United States Army, to contain the fire by creating fire breaks. We do have some images, and yes, there is video available, although it's really difficult to ascertain exactly what's going on. And you might remember the fate of this particular structure in this amazing building that we're looking at. The building did survive, although it was changed, it was altered. And some of these images I have to question, because how did they get such wonderful images when this was all happening? There happened to be photographers nearby. There happened to be somebody with a video camera nearby. Well, maybe I can't completely discount the possibility. The technology, according to the official historical account, did exist. It's just very intriguing. It's intriguing that we have these interesting images that create more questions than answers they provide about what really happened with these series of disasters in San Francisco in the early 1900s. Unfortunately, there's nobody that we can talk to who was around to witness these events firsthand, and perhaps give us a firsthand account of what happened. Now, I'm not suggesting that our records have been altered or anything so absurd like that. I just think it would be interesting to talk to somebody who was really there. What was the sequence of events? I mean, we have it recorded, but oddly enough, the images seem to give us the impression that something far more disastrous actually occurred in San Francisco. And I don't mean to be very smug about it, because it's rather strange. An earthquake, a series of fires, a response by the army to try to create fire breaks by intentionally destroying buildings. And yet we see everything. We see vast amounts of rubble. And it corresponds to other images that we've seen of cities from the 1800s that were destroyed by fire. There's many anomalies with San Francisco that wonderful on-site explorers such as I Am Kairos have looked at. And it would have been really nice to actually get inside the cliff house here and really get a better idea for what it was like in person. And you know how I am about images. Images are nice and they provide clues, but there's nothing like exploring something on the ground. Imagine having the opportunity to explore the original City Hall in San Francisco on the ground. Now, there's a very interesting account of the construction of this City Hall. And we know that the City Hall was destroyed, lost, in the earthquake or disaster of 1906. But originally the order to construct it began in 1871. San Francisco had brought in a special architect, of course, and yet spent years trying to build it. You can see here it's incomplete. It's missing its central tower with a very nice statue on it, although they did manage to complete this other dome. And for 20 years they labored on trying to complete this impressive City Hall. Now, can you imagine anyone trying to build anything like this today? Very interesting, though, that despite this being clearly before the 1890s, we have a powered trolley. Well, it's San Francisco, of course, it makes a lot of sense. There's also this very intriguing monument that was in front of the City Hall. And oddly enough, we think of the other monuments that we've looked at and what they truly reflect. Now, again, keep in mind that this would have been constructed in the 1890s, maybe the 1880s. So what conflict would this have reflected? The Civil War? How much of a part did California really play in the U.S. Civil War? Well, it certainly played a little bit more of a role in the Mexican War, and they did send an expedition to assist the Union during the Civil War. But oddly enough, we still see the interesting symbolism that we see in other Civil War monuments. Do they call it the Civil War? Do they call it the War between the States or the War of the Rebellion? And what exactly does this figure up here have to do with the Civil War? But moving on past that, we consider the struggle that the official historical account gives about the construction of this City Hall in San Francisco. 1871 to 1891. And certainly the good people of San Francisco, and indeed the municipal government, had to feel pressured because at that same time, places such as Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin were building amazing courthouses and even their state capitals in a shorter amount of time than it took them to build this City Hall. Now, I certainly don't want to underplay the difficulty and challenge of building this incredible City Hall. According to the official account, they had to bring in a series of architects in the 1890s to finish the Great Tower, and you can see that this City Hall is an entire complex that appears to take up a complete city block. So it certainly compares with those courthouses and those state capitals. And eventually they were able to finish the tower that was missing here in the middle. But when we look at these images, does this really appear to be something that's brand new? Or does it look just a little older for some reason? Again, I leave it to you to decide because we don't know the exact dates behind the images. We're informed and we have a chronology, but apparently in the 1890s they managed to add the Great Tower and the Dome to the top of the City Hall of San Francisco. And it only lasted a few years prior to the disaster of 1906 before it was lost. But what was really the construction quality on it? Official accounts tell us that it had a very poor construction quality. And yet when we look at images, it appears as though that it's a very impressive structure. So what's the reality behind it? What's the true account? If they spent so many years constructing it, one would expect that it's a structure of the same quality of something such as the Iowa State Capitol. Yet official accounts also tell us that the Iowa State Capitol was rather rickety, and that's why it had to be renovated all the time. That there was that impressive limestone that they got out of the Mississippi River Valley that was already falling off in the early 1900s. And so the fact that they spent well over 20 years constructing this City Hall, that it was of rather poor construction. Let me ask you, does anything in this structure really appear to be poor construction? Or is it just artwork and not durability? Is that what we're expected to accept? And it may be the true account. It is what the official historical account says. It just doesn't make a lot of sense when we consider how the building just seemed to completely fall apart with the earthquake. And you'll say, well, it was an earthquake. It was a very powerful earthquake, and it makes sense. But there's something rather strange about the images that we have about how this building fell apart. It's almost as though the earthquake shook it apart in a very precise manner, as though to reveal to us how poorly constructed this building may have really been, as though to show us that they really didn't put a lot of effort into it, even though it took them nearly 30 years to construct this impressive city hall. There's also the comparative fact that we have no shortage of state capitals, courthouses, and many other buildings that were constructed in the 1850s, no shortage of churches across the Midwest, across the East Coast, across the entire land in the United States that are still standing. So why was this city hall constructed in this manner? This is San Francisco. This was a city that was a boom city. This was a city that was part of the gold rush. And it's, of course, the best major natural port on the west coast of the United States. Now, of course, San Diego can compete with that claim, but at the time, it was the main way to access these settlements. And of course, we know that the west of the United States was growing rapidly. But how exactly do we account for these images of destruction? How do we explain this incredible rubbling? And oddly enough, the many images that we do have of the City Hall do seem to paint a conflicting account. Some images seem to show it being more intact, and yet other images show more rubble. Perhaps the thing simply fell apart given a few days and weeks after this terrifying earthquake. What factor did the fire breaks that were being established by the army to try to stop the fire play into the destruction of the City Hall, if any? These are all questions that we have. But much like with the other photos of utter city destruction that we've looked at over time in our exploration, we do see many underlying signs that are repeated. Signs of rubbling, signs of what's supposed to be a fire, and yet very precise construction. There's another bizarre fact that there are postcards that show the destruction of the City Hall in San Francisco. Now, I've always found it rather odd that they would actually make postcards or pictures like this that show the destruction of the City Hall. Perhaps they just really wanted to remember it, and I'm not saying that it's impossible. It's just interesting that someone would want to commemorate a disaster in this way. I don't know, maybe I see it as sort of like putting a disaster on some of your money. It's not something that you see people do, but not to say that it's impossible. It's just interesting. The artwork on this is interesting, especially when we compare and contrast it with some of the images that we have. This is from Brigham Young University, and oddly enough, it gives a slightly different account of the destruction of the City Hall. From this particular perspective, it looks like the building is relatively intact. So what exactly is this rubble that we see in front here? Are these the actual bricks from it, or are they from something else? It becomes more difficult to really ascertain what's going on. And that's why I lament the fact that we don't have a first-hand account, somebody who is actually there, that we could talk to. Perhaps we could have a little bit more confidence, a little better fidelity with what was really going on. What was the sequence of events? Because it is possible that records, unintentionally, could be incorrect. It could also be possible that the record preservation could have been affected. And this is the current City Hall in San Francisco, constructed in the 19-teens, yes, about the same time that that incredible exposition was going on, and completed about the same time. And you can see that this particular City Hall, in the incredible Beaux Arts style, does match the wondrous state capitals and other county courthouses that we've looked at. What an impressive dome and spire on this dome. And I have looked at this in brevity before in a joint exploration with Old World Exploration. But looking at some of the construction photos, it's very intriguing that it seems that this very impressive City Hall started in this manner. Now again, I'm not suggesting anything that seems amiss or strange just by the images themselves. Yes, it's entirely possible that building such an incredible structure as the current San Francisco City Hall could have started like this. It's just rather intriguing that in these images we see many of the same things that we see in the other images of the construction of these rather spectacular buildings. A lot of framework. And yet you would think that if the other City Hall was made of the similar framework, which the earthquake very fortuitously showed us, then wouldn't they alter their construction a little bit? Is that really what it's made out of? Just a series of beams? And does it really line up with the interior? And we're going to take some closer looks at the interior of this structure upon its completion. And I want you to remember what you're seeing right now with the way that this framework, which clearly is the load bearing of the structure, looks like. And then compare and contrast it with what we see of the interior. And let me know if you think it's the same building. We must have the architect there who's personally supervising it. And as we see in subsequent photographs, we see that they're now building the exterior of the structure, or putting all the great stones in place. Now, if you live in San Francisco, or if you're around San Francisco, or maybe if you're IM Kairos, you can go visit the City Hall and ascertain the actual material that the exterior is constructed out of. Does this really look like a series of blocks that you could just lift into place this easily? Maybe, perhaps. But it's very intriguing, especially when you consider the complete opulence and beauty of this structure. The 19 teens, the amazing capability that we had across the land to still build incredible structures like this. What was the financial state of the United States? Because usually the explanation about how we could do something like this is that we had a lot of money available. Well, I guess you could say that this building was constructed after the imposition of the federal income tax, although that wouldn't have been used to fund this structure, as this is a city structure in the state of California. And we also had the Federal Reserve established, and we know that their ability to set currency rates is critical to maintain a stable economy, as subsequent events would prove. But when you look at the City Hall, you see that upon its completion, there's something about it that seems to be far beyond those construction images that we just looked at. There's something even more opulent and impressive about this structure that seems to be beyond a simple framework construction. And yet, when you look at some of the images from the 1940s, the 1950s, the structure already appears far older than just a few decades. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible that there could have been some unfortunate error situations, or it just simply could have been prone to getting dirty. In fact, they say that the Iowa State Capitol got dirty very quickly right after they built it. So why not the City Hall in San Francisco? Yet when you look at the interior of the City Hall and see what is termed the Beaux Arts architectural style, you see opulence and beauty and artistic expression, along with geometric precision, that seems to defy all explanation. And it certainly defies what we just looked at in those framework images of construction earlier. And of course, this being a very popular wedding venue, one of the indicators of a genuine old world structure, you can also see, though, that there is detailing, especially looking in some of the concave nature of these archways, where there's even more artwork and symbolism that's been positioned. How easy was that to do? What exactly did this take? Are we to believe that this was carved? Was this formed? Why don't we have any construction images of the construction of the interior? How did they get the columns in place? I guess that's just not interesting to get photos of. For that matter, how'd they build the banister that we're looking at right now? I would certainly like to know that. How did they get all those steps in there? And how did they fit it all in there with that framework that we saw in the construction photos? Those are many of the questions that we have. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that there's any sort of cover-up or conspiracy. No, not at all. Merely pointing out some observational details that we see. And if you go to this structure in person and you explore the inside of it, you will certainly find yourself taken by all the impressive detail. And I have to ask, what exactly do we think these symbols really mean? This is the United States, California, San Francisco, in the 19 teens. So the very early 20th century, well over 100 years ago. But what exactly does this symbol that we're looking at really mean? What does it reflect? What do these other symbols actually mean? And why go through all this effort to put in all these symbols? How exactly were these symbols put in? Because we don't have construction photos, and we certainly don't have video footage. We have video footage of the old City Hall after it was rubbled. It's about 30 seconds long. Maybe there's more video footage. And of course, I'm always fascinated by how video footage is always found. Again, I'm not questioning anything. But why is it we don't have a better documentation of the construction, especially of the interior of this impressive City Hall? And yet you look at other photos, such as this one purported to be from the 1920s, and oddly enough, despite the fact that it's just over 10 years old, it already seems to look a lot older. Again, maybe it's possible that, because of that error in San Francisco or anywhere else across the land, it just got a little older. What exactly do those figures represent, those faces that we see? And the interior. What exactly are these images that we see that are impressed or carved into the wall? And How did they get all these columns in place? How did they establish this decoration on the very ceiling of the rotunda? Why, again, are there no construction photos of it? And we now go to the Midwest in Omaha. Omaha, Nebraska, a city we haven't really explored yet, and it's on my list. But I wanted to look at some different examples from the Midwest and Omaha, Nebraska. And what you're looking at could really be any small town in the Midwest where you see the remnants of an old world building. And yet in nearby Clarinda, Iowa, they have this very impressive bank, the Page County Bank, I believe it is. And in Clarinda, Iowa, it's also interesting that they have an asylum that's very nearby. Now, why would anybody build a bank in a small town in an isolated part of southwest Iowa? Oh, but of course they remembered to put the year on the building. I wonder, why don't we put the years on our current buildings, our glass and steel skyscrapers? And then, of course, reflecting other parts of the Midwest, such as the very impressive Art Museum, or maybe you should just call it the Art Castle in Detroit. We've looked at this before, and again, this is another structure that seems to defy explanation. The other thing that I find puzzling about it is that they just didn't call this an armory of some type. And then, oddly enough, this neoclassical center, and what exactly is this supposed to be? Again, this is stated to be in Detroit, at least according to the image. Now, of course, I don't know for sure because these structures aren't still standing. What exactly is this, anyway? Yes, we know they'll call this neoclassical architectural style, but the Ancient Order of the Gleaners? Do we have another fraternal organization out there that we're not aware of? Well, I guess it was the 1800s. And Detroit certainly had their own version of a Union Station. Again, that very impressive red rock material, whatever it actually is. Red granite, red rock. There's many different names for it, although maybe it has the same name. And you might recall the impressive train station that we saw when we explored Milwaukee in Wisconsin last week. Ah, yes, a streetcar, a trolley, and no horses pulling it. Well, that warms my heart to see. And yet Detroit also had its own opera house because, well, everybody needed to have an opera house, especially in the 1800s and the 1900s. Even the very small community of Mantorville, Minnesota still has an opera house, and it barely has a population of 1,000 or 2,000 max. And they even have a courthouse that was designed by our favorite architect, E. Townsend Mix. Here we have the residence of M. Goldsmith in Cincinnati, Ohio. Ah, yes, back in the time frame when everybody was apparently a millionaire and they could afford building a structure like this. A structure that you would probably not hear anything going on outside, even if a bomb went off. I wonder if the architect bore a striking resemblance to actor Jürgen Prochnow. Who knows? And now we explore Jobbers Canyon back in Omaha, Nebraska. This is a very interesting situation because we have this very large industrial area, primarily of warehouses. And now these structures that we're about to look at may not seem that impressive. And yet this is a very large area that was added to the National Register of Historic Places that was demolished in the late 1980s as part of urban renewal. And indeed, when you look closer at many of these structures, you do actually see greater hints of opulence. And if these are all just warehouses, and we will examine the stated purpose of these buildings, then why was this much effort put into them? Where did the city of Omaha get all these bricks or these blocks? And why put effort into putting artistic stylings on many of these structures that are just for industrial purposes? I mean, I can certainly understand if you need to build them to last, but for example here, you see the fine archways in these windows, and you even have the small columns. And it begs the question, why? This is just supposed to be a market area that was constructed primarily in the early 1900s in Omaha, Nebraska. What is the purpose behind putting this sort of effort into building these buildings? Because we certainly know this is not how modern industrial buildings are constructed to this day. And yes, this is one example where I could accept the mainstream explanations, because it's cost effective. But did somebody not concern themselves with cost effectiveness with the buildings of Jobbers Canyon? One of the buildings shown in the following pages was demolished, 1988 and 1989, comprised of 22 contributing warehouses. Yes, a great loss. And we see here with the American Radiator Company, built in 1905. And yet they threw portal windows on it. I guess you need that for a Radiator Company building in 1905. And what exactly do we have here? The Richardson Building. New Idea Building. How fitting. 1891. And many of these other structures, we can see their stated purpose behind them. Individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And if you're wondering why this entire series of buildings, this entire block was demolished, it's because the major corporation ConAgra wanted to build their corporate headquarters. And the official account says that their CEO is not particularly fond of historic buildings. And many people will say that these were just ugly warehouse buildings anyway. But really, were they so ugly? Or was there a little bit more to this account? Is it possible there was something about these buildings that perhaps we just shouldn't have seen, or maybe we weren't supposed to see? For example, the basic question is, why would anybody put this kind of effort into constructing a warehouse building? And if you're wondering what my theory is, well, maybe there is something to the fact that there was more infrastructure that managed to reach us from the previous era, or the end of the Fourth Era. And maybe there were more examples that survived on the interior of these structures that for whatever reason we weren't supposed to see. Or, as I'm always fond of saying, it is possible that the mainstream historical account is correct. But with each exploration, the possibility of that continues to diminish. I'll still always bring it on the table, though. But a very odd series of constructions. The Cold Storage Company building, 1913 and 1919. And then looking at the more recent images, we can see that a lot of the beauty in these structures still endured until the very day that they were demolished. And if you look up the official documented failures of urban renewal, Jobbers Canyon in Omaha, Nebraska is at the top of the list, especially with the sheer numbers of structures that they demolished. And what do we have here? Decoration above this window or doorway? I really wonder what details were lost when this entire area was demolished. And remember that the influence of one company managed to overcome the fact that these structures, this entire area, was on the National Register of Historic Places. Perhaps this is a cautionary tale for other structures. Looking across Omaha, though, you will find that there are other buildings that were lost to time that show the more detailed construction knowledge that was also applied in other more artistically impressive structures. For example, just the way these structures come together here. And even in this very impressive hotel, the Hotel Fontenelle, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And yes, this is the best quality image that I can find, and as I've stated before, I do not alter images, not even for the sake of a presentation. I show you the images exactly as I find them. Now, not to say somebody else didn't alter the image, but I have not. Nice interior and a lobby here, and apparently this hotel welcomed President Truman. Ah, how fitting. President Truman, the very president who was actually behind the urban renewal in the United States. Now, of course, I'm not questioning political policy. It's just it was under his administration that urban renewal started with the Housing Act, which was a continuation of earlier acts under the New Deal. This was the New Fair Deal. And, not to be political about it, but Eisenhower did continue the New Deal policies. Even Nixon continued the New Deal policies. We'll talk about him later as well, because he comes up. What an impressive hotel, though. And very interesting that they seem to master such a structure where we see the foundation, and notice that they seem to have the slant construction with the foundation mastered quite well in Omaha, Nebraska. How exactly were they able to achieve that in the early 1900s? And all these incredible hotels, how do you think they compare with our modern hotels? And what exactly is the purpose of these impressive decorations on these top floors? And where have we seen these little spires before? Well, of course, they're always associated with what we call Gothic architecture. You'll see them on churches. And then the Omaha Athletic Club. Ah, yes, just what you need for an athletic club in the late 1800s, early 1900s. A very artistically appealing building with many decorative elements in it. And again, I ask, where'd they get all the brick? Did they have a special deal or arrangement with St. Louis? Because, as we're told in the official historical account, there was lots of brick production in St. Louis. So they just shipped it all to Omaha. Easily explained. And here we have another one of these federal building post offices. Or if you go to another city, it would probably be a city hall. Really, it could have any one of a number of functions. And thinking back to the Federal Building Post Office that we came across in La Crosse, Wisconsin, I have to wonder, was there any special symbols that were lost? And oddly enough, we see another example of the impressive slant construction that they had mastered. And here with these arches and these many small columns in this impressive entryway, which reflects the city hall that we saw in St. Louis. This is Thos R. Kimball, an architect. He was also involved in the Great Exposition that occurred in Omaha. Yes, Omaha had an exposition as well. And he designed many of the buildings that appeared. And, they were constructed of staff or temporary materials. But he was also responsible for many of the structures in Omaha. Basically, Omaha's version of E. Townsend Mix. Every city has one. To include St. Cecilia's here. Now, the interesting account behind this one is Mr. Kimball apparently architected this in the early 1900s, but it took them over 50 years to build it. Ah, yes, another one of these churches that takes them a very long time to construct. Well, it's a very elaborate church, and interesting materials behind it. Now, the official account says they had to bring in other architects in Omaha, and they didn't finish it until the 1950s. And what exactly material is this constructed out of? And did they really finish this in the 1950s? Or did they simply finish finishing it, if you follow me? Not really sure, but nice smokestack on it. And here we have another one of these postcards that just shows us how impressive the downtown of Omaha was in the distant past. Are we looking at the city hall? Are we looking at the county courthouse? It looks like we have City Hall and Hotel Fontanelle there in the distance. Oh yes, and the actual signs of urban renewal right here. This isn't Hotel Fontanelle, but this is the destruction of another building from yet another one of these interesting societies or fraternal agencies that we come across. This particular one being the Woodmen of the World. And this was another impressive structure from the early 1900s that was demolished. And I had never heard of the Woodmen of the World, so that's two interesting organizations that we've come across just in this exploration alone. And what exactly do they represent? Well, we'll take a look in a second, but they demolished their original building and then built this more modern, if you want to call it that, and very nondescript building that is currently their Woodmen headquarters, because it says it, World of Woodmen. What exactly does this organization do? Because, as I said, I've never really heard of them. Well, apparently they're all over the place, to include isolated locations such as Nacogdoches, Texas, where they have this very impressive brick building. And who knows, perhaps this brick came from St. Louis itself. But what exactly do they do? Well, apparently they're another one of those benevolent organizations that are just really there to help people. They're not for profit. Oh, and apparently one of their specialities is constructing these tombstones that appear to look like tree stumps. Well, how impressive. I don't know where I've seen any of this symbolism before, but, it's just another one of those benevolent organizations that's out there doing its thing. And let's go to New York City and look at the Empire State structures that are no longer with us. And we've explored the World's building before, but it's rather intriguing looking at this image from the 1890s in New York City and comparing and contrasting. Now, one interesting thing I didn't mention about the disasters going back to San Francisco was they inform us that to recover from the disasters in 1906, they unfortunately had to kill a lot of animals, working them very hard. Now, while that's a tragic story and it may affect me a little emotionally, the objective part of my mind pulls back because we're also informed that we did have early heavy machinery. So why were they bothering with animals? How exactly did they build these buildings? This was all done with human and animal power in the 1890s in New York City? Even more challenging given the very compressed urban environment that we see that was already very clearly present. And looking at some of the details in this image, you can get an idea for scale on these buildings. I think the World building was always very impressive to me because basically it looks like a Capitol building that's on a skyscraper. But we see that the primary mode of transportation is horse and cart. And then, of course, there is the references to the intense efforts of urban renewal in New York City from the 1940s to the 1960s. And it involved this. And no, we're not even going to talk about the Bronx in this particular exploration. That's for another time. We're focused more on Manhattan. But you'll find no shortage of images and documentation that show the efforts that they underwent to bring down a lot of these buildings during this process of urban renewal. And what were they really constructed out of, and what was the material? Why is it some old world buildings survive and seem indestructible to this day, and yet others didn't? And I certainly invite your response in the comments on that one. Here we have the Palace of Detention. Apparently this was where people awaiting trial were taken in the 1800s in New York City. It was called the Palace of Detention because apparently it resembled an Egyptian tomb, I guess, and it was designed in the early 1800s, or at least the 1830s. And not only was it called the Palace of Detention, or also called the Tombs, it even included this little Bridge of Sighs. Ah yes, much like in Venice. What is it with all these bridges of sighs that we have all over the place? Why is it everybody who's being taken to prison or confinement and then they have a bridge of sighs that they see, whether it's under a street or a canal? This is the modern House of Detention, constructed in 1940s in New York City, and I guess it has a little miniature Bridge of Sighs up there, or Bridge of I Don't Care. Very, very fascinating construction, though. How interesting that in the 1930s we were building these Art Deco buildings left and right all over the United States, but then we were reduced to this brutalist architecture. Here you go. The houses of many millionaires who taught at Columbia University, apparently. Because remember, everybody was a millionaire in the late 1800s, early 1900s. How is it there are so many of these impressive structures? And why is it if these houses are left to their own devices, they would still be standing to this day? Here we have Columbia College of Expression, and the impressive school that has a house, much like the house that we saw at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. What is with this anyway? Did we just build this house to be part of the university? Or is it possible that it was repurposed from some other original intention? Hard to say. And here we have the Apollo Theater, another one of these incredible theaters that shows the intricate neoclassical architecture, columns and pillars, and what exactly is the material this is constructed out of. It's just simple concrete. It's very well documented. Yes, I know. Silly me for asking questions. Yes. Another one of these wonderful armories that was right in the middle of New York City. And you can't really have an armory unless you have many towers and turrets and a very, very tall tower. This is very odd with the way that this tower is constructed. So if this is supposed to be an armory, was the New York militia expecting to fight a major siege battle here? This is the construction of the Cathedral of St. John, the Divine, in New York City, and we can see that we have the subway or the elevated rail tracks going by right past it. I guess this is the best construction image that we could get. And I'm well aware that this particular building has a reputation, apparently, for causing certain other people to question the fact that the old world ever could have existed. Or was it a different church? I guess it doesn't really matter. But you can see that we have the same little spires that we saw on the hotel in Omaha. So what exactly is that all about? Well, it's simply Gothic architecture. People love to build things in a difficult format. And that includes matching your churches and cathedrals with your hotels, especially in the 1800s and the early 1900s. It's very well documented. Or is it? This is very intriguing. The Columbia Building, Lower Broadway in 1892. And what a unique structure this is. And keep in mind, this is in the nascent era of skyscraper construction, literally right after they started it. And yet they could pull off intricacies with this kind of structure. And you can see that this appears to be a much more elaborate building, I'd even say building complex, than initially meets the eye. And what was the intention behind this building? Was this a business building? Was this a hotel? Was this another athletic club originally? I'd never really even heard of the Columbia Building until this particular exploration. And what exactly is with constructing this archway all the way up here? What purpose does this serve? We just need to put an arch towards the top floors. It looks cool. Is that really what the architect said? Is that what the contractor said? Well, remember, this was the 1800s where the architect designed the building, but then they could be dismissed for having nothing to do with the construction because, unless the architect built it with their bare hands. You may as well call them the architect there in that particular situation. It should be noted there's also a Columbia building in Louisville, Kentucky. Excuse me, I meant Louisville, because Louisville is clearly named after some guy named King Lou and not King Louis, right? Okay, not picking on anybody from Kentucky, but I just find it kind of interesting how they pronounce it based on what it's named after. That's how you know who's from an area. And back to Columbia University, and what an impressive layout for the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now, I don't have the exact date behind this image. Maybe somebody does, and you're more than welcome to let me know in the comments. But what exactly is this representing here with what we see with some of the infrastructure? We have an operational trolley, an extensive, I'm guessing they're electric lines. Are they all telegraph lines? Well, what is going on there? And now we go to the very interesting Dewey Arch, constructed for the hero of the Spanish-American War in his Battle of the Philippines, Admiral George Dewey. They gave him an arch as part of his triumph. And interestingly enough, in this arch, you can see that it matches all the great triumph arches that we have across Europe, especially the ones in France. Now, the official account tells us that this arch was made out of that temporary staff construction material, so basically one step above paper mache. And as soon as they built it for the victory parade, it began to fall apart. But there's some odd details and peculiarities about this arch. There are images and figures that don't seem to match what we'd expect in the United States in 1900, or right around the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s. What do we have here? An angel, a Valkyrie? What's the point of that? Now, we do have some figures down here who look like it's actual American sailors from the Battle of Manila Bay, which this arch is supposed to commemorate because that was the battle that Admiral George Dewey presided over or commanded. And here we have some more. But why does it almost appear that some of these images are augmented or added? And who knows? What's really the original arch? Was there something already there? Or did they decide to build these figures with these impressive angels on them? Hard to say, and I'm not really sure. And what's going on back here? Behind the arch, it looks like we have some sort of obelisk. Is this another one of those obelisks that they brought over from Egypt or somewhere else that they just loaded up on a ship? Not really sure, hadn't seen it. So Dewey's Arch. And how exactly do you commemorate a national war hero by building them a monument that falls apart as soon as the parade's over? Well, sorry, your monument fell over and the parade was over. You might remember that joke from Rocky that he was upset in Rocky Balboa after they took his statue down. Is it because your arch fell over because they constructed it out of temporary construction material or paper mache or staff? And what exactly is this structure back here? Does anybody know? In New York City? I'm not exactly sure myself, so let me know in the comments. And then we have no shortage of the very impressive hotels that are very ornately decorated, as they had to be, because, not only should a hotel be beautiful on the inside, it should be very beautiful and ornate on the outside. Broadway and 71st Street, so, several blocks south of Cathedral. Yes, I still remember that area. And here we have Grant's tomb. An early image of Grant's tomb, and look how new it looks. Unless they just freshly painted it, I'm not really sure. Did verify that was constructed according to the official mainstream account in the 1890s. And of course, it's yet another replica of that mausoleum of Helicanarsis that we just can't get enough of in the United States. That thing pops up all over the place. But then, of course, you have these other impressive hotels. The Hotel Netherland, interestingly named, and it almost looks like some of the structures that we see that, well, it's really hard to describe. There's something very fairy tale in nature about this, even the structures next to it. What construction material is this made out of? And why do we have these arches here? And the great library at Columbia University with its dome structure, because, you need to know that you have many stairs and many columns that you're actually going into a library. It should be a physical exertion to get into a library. Maybe that's why we could explain that people were more well-read in the early 1900s, 1800s. They had to go through a lot more physical effort just to read the books. Perhaps that's the explanation behind it. It all makes sense. It's all very well documented. Couldn't get a name behind this particular structure, but interested that it's very prominently affiliated with New York City and Lower Manhattan. Then, of course, we have our nice little Old Glory flying above it, just so you know what nation you're really in. Riverside Church, another impressive structure that this particular one did survive to this day. And we'll look at it here in some live action footage, but What's intriguing to me is this almost seems like a structure that perhaps wasn't supposed to reach us. And for some reason, I'm reminded of the Cathedral of Learning, and I can't think of why. Ah, the city prison, the Tombs. What a name for a prison. We call it the Tombs. Now, they say they called it the Tombs because it looked like an Egyptian temple, apparently. But yet in this particular postcard, and there we see the Bridge of Sighs, the original Bridge of Sighs, before it was replaced by the Bridge of I Don't Care in the very unfortunate replacement to it. And here we have Times Square. Yes, what Times Square appeared like before they put all the digital screens all over the place and made it look like a modern TV or sports bar. Very interesting seeing the amount of people and the amount of vehicles that are on the roadway in this early time frame in Times Square. The Hotel Astoria, the beautiful and very incredible hotel that was brought down in the late 1920s to make way for the Empire State Building. And look at all those impressive bell towers on top of this. And those aren't real bell towers, or maybe they are, who knows? And then we have another one of these very interesting and impressive theaters, the Ziegfeld, if I'm pronouncing that properly. Ah, yes, we just can't get enough of these unique theaters, and they're all over the place. Look at the stairs over there to the right. Ah, yes, there's your old-fashioned fire escape. It was considered a fire hazard. Looking closer, though, we do see some interesting motifs and some symbols on this particular theater. It's always with these theaters that we tend to see these things. And apparently this is all that's left of the facade of it that you can still visit to this day. And yet there's a very interesting detail when we see this particular figure. What exactly is with the headdress here? Is it just my imagination, or does that seem like a more advanced headdress than we'd expect on someone from the late 1890s, early 1900s? And finally, Penn Station, constructed in 1910, demolished in 1963. Was with us just over half a century. What an impressive and historic structure. And we see some of the most incredible examples of any train station, and we've certainly looked at many Union stations. And yet there's something about this one that's even more opulent, even more colossal in its size, especially when one considers the interior. I can't help but ponder the questions, why was this incredible edifice torn down? We have our official explanations, but we're also informed that many people, the original architects, others, who are apparently still around in the early 1960s, opposed the demolishment of this particular structure. And yet we have many of the same symbols that appear. Now, an eagle, I suppose you could say that's an American symbol, that's affiliated with an American symbol. And yet, what exactly is represented by this structure? Now, remember, we had photographs and we even had video footage of the destruction in San Francisco in 1906. But 4 years later, in New York City, we can't really get anything better than a painting of establishing the foundation and digging out the foundation for this very impressive and famous rail station in the middle of Manhattan. Don't you find that interesting? Well, maybe they just committed all of their expenses to build such an opulent and colossal train station, and they didn't have any money left over to hire a photographer, or even somebody with a video camera. You see in this particular image, though, that the structure appears far older than just over 50 years. Now, of course, you could say, well, it's New York City, so it might have aged a lot faster because this is the early 1960s. Prior to it being demolished. And no, I'm not really keen on showing any of the demolishing photos because it really demolishes the spirit. But looking at the interior, it's an incredible structure that really appears like a palace on the inside. Looking at all the detailing that goes into the columns and especially the ceiling with the fine designs. Now, of course, if you look hard enough and you look at the photos that we have of the destruction of this building, all in the name of urban renewal, of course, you'll see, oddly enough, a similarity to what we saw earlier with the original City Hall in San Francisco. As though we're supposed to believe that this is all just a very cheap facade and that it's over this framework. Really? A construction like this was just put over a bunch of framework? And you can find the images yourself, and I'm going to focus more on what we have that give us an idea of the opulence. And this is considered one of the widest spaces interior in New York City during this time frame, and one could certainly see why. There is a little bit of a survival of some pieces of the structure. Here are the eagles in Kansas City and apparently these figures. And again, if this is an authentic figure that was from Penn Station, constructed in 1910, outside of the eagles, what exactly does this have to do with anything American? Well, it's been replaced by the Moynihan Station now, as it's called, that sits in the same spot. And you can see we have the signs of modernity from our current era. Oh, it looks so nice and functional and very, very cost-effectively built, because that all makes perfect sense. Moynihan, who's that named after? Ah, yes, Daniel Moynihan, who actually served on Nixon's staff as the advisor of domestic policy. In fact, it's stated he's the one who convinced President Nixon to expand and create many federal programs that we still have today, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, and least I not mention OSHA. So they didn't have OSHA while they were doing this urban renewal. How fitting. As we look at this footage, though, of Riverside Church, this impressive, incredible Gothic cathedral that did survive to us to this day, and again, I'm reminded of the Cathedral of Learning in Pennsylvania, we have to ask, what's the real account behind these structures? Is it possible that they really built this structure in the 1920s, the early 1930s? A church like this, with this sort of layout? And yet in Omaha, they were struggling to build a church for 5 decades. Why is it we have these conflicting accounts? And why is it that this particular incredible cathedral matches anything that we have in Europe? And I would say that it does. And looking across New York City to this day with aerial footage, you can still see many signs of the old world structures, although they tend to be concealed by the more modern buildings. And so what's the true legacy of urban renewal? It seems as though whether it was a conflict, a war, or a policy, we end up at best with old world buildings that are concealed and hidden amongst the modern buildings. And at worst, they're just completely destroyed and we can't analyze them anymore. But many do survive. And I strongly suggest if you have the opportunity to do on-site explorations, you do them. Welcome to the Rescued Orbis channel, and today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to look at some lost buildings of Tartaria, or buildings that are no longer with us. Traditionally on the channel, we've preferred an approach of exploring buildings that we can still all go explore in person, but today we're going to pay some homage to buildings that have been lost through the passage of time.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was, and the dream of what could be.
So starting here with Hotel Flanders, 1905 in Philadelphia, we see that we have a very well-developed and well-constructed structure, and our approach for most of these buildings is we're not going to be as focused as much on the history, but we're going to appreciate them for how they existed when they were around. We'll also find out that many of them were lost in the 1960s for some unknown reason. We'll begin by looking at the Wabash Terminal in Pittsburgh. And here in these early 20th century images, we can see that this is a very impressive structure. Yes, of course, this is exactly what you need for a terminal, because if you don't have a very unique dome on the top of it, how are people going to know it's actually a terminal? Not that they'd confuse it with a courthouse or a state capitol or some other municipal building. Look at this symbol right here and the detailing right above the main entryway. Very impressive, and of course it has no shortage of columns. What exactly is it made out of, though? It looks to be some sort of very fine type of concrete, but is it a real concrete, Portland cement, or Rossendale maybe? Or maybe even Roman concrete for all we know. It is documented that this was part of the terminal station, but once again, you always ask that question. We've seen many magnificent train terminals across the nation. Why do you need a dome on top of it? And perhaps that's a question I'm not supposed to be asking, but I'm going to ask it regardless, because it is a very impressive structure. And yet we look at some of the images and we see this very modern and sleek looking building. And yes, this is a modern and sleek looking building that's made out of some sort of stone, although in different images we see that the clock looks a little different. So there's no doubt about it that they altered the clock perhaps over the years, but who knows for sure? Because remember, we're just looking at images. Now, images don't necessarily prove anything definitively, but they provide clues. And the clues we're provided is that this is a very impressive building. And why is it that we always come across these impressive buildings that have all these unique columns on them and all these foundation stones? And again, I'm wondering how far this building went into the ground. Wonderful building to start off with. Now let's go to the NASB building in Toledo. Toledo, Ohio, that is, not to be confused with Toledo, Iowa, which is the county seat of Tama County in Iowa. But in Toledo, Ohio, they have this very impressive NASB building. And look at the tower on this. Now you're saying, well, this is just a postcard. Do you have any images for us? Well, yes, there just may happen to be a few images. And look at the tower on this building. Now, of course, you'll ask the same questions. Why exactly do you need such a wondrous tower with all these interesting adornments on the top of it and these battlements, if you will? This is quite an impressive building, and yet when you get towards the foundation or the first couple of floors, you can see the wondrous arches on it. And we can see why this would be a mainstay feature within the skyline of Toledo, Ohio, and why they would take pride in this building. So one would be under the impression that this is a building that they would, like to preserve or keep around, certainly. That this is a building that would still be with us today and it would be unaltered. Well, when we get to the 1960s, we can see that there is a terrifying fate that awaits this building. Because we know what happened in the 1960s, and that was that great period in the United States of what they called urban renewal. And many buildings, unfortunately, were torn down. And I'm sure many buildings had this thought in the 1960s. And unfortunately, the NASB building met a fate worse than death in the fact that it was cut down, altered, destroyed, and its glory completely lost. It's quite a tragedy. And why is it in the 1960s that we accepted this, that the great cultures of the United States accepted this fate for the buildings, that this was urban renewal in progress? Your wonderful artistic buildings that represented your history, lost forever. Well, let's go to Boston to look at the Hotel Westminster, and another early 20th century photo and a series of early 20th century photos, and we see a very impressive and complicated structure. Once again, it appears to be made out of stone, limestone, sandstone, or some sort of advanced concrete that we may not be able to identify, and unfortunately, because this building's no longer with us, we can't ascertain or get any sort of idea of what the actual construction materials were. Regardless, the images provide numerous clues that this was quite an impressive structure, and on this postcard, you can see why this would be a very fancy hotel that someone would want to stay at. And I'm quite surprised that they tore this down because, again, this is something else that we could still be using to this day as quite a fancy 5-star hotel, quite similar to the one that we looked at in Dallas earlier this week. We can see that there's other impressive buildings around the Westminster Hotel, and Boston is no shortage of wondrous old world buildings and quite intriguing older photos that provide many clues with the streetcars or trolleys, depending on what particular region you're in the United States, in terms of what they call them. But we see other impressive buildings, such as the Trinity Church there to the left. Now, there's quite the contradiction, though, when we consider what's available on the street, because is this photo really showing us what's actually going on, or is it giving us clues that there was something else going on in Boston at the time? And here we have the great public library in Boston. We did explore this back during the Boston exploration. And again, I'm questioning how exactly they pulled off the construction of this. It was supposedly in the late 19th century, and yet the structure seems to have a, dare I say, dirty look to the exterior of it. So what exactly is going on? Well, it was all the soot from the chimneys and all the coal they were burning, and that's usually our explanation. Of course, you might recall in the earlier photo, we saw a very pristine-looking building. So is that after they cleaned it off or repainted it? Maybe. We just don't know. We're just positing suppositions here. But yet you can see that the skyline of Boston has always looked impressive, and I thought it would be fitting to take a look at a couple different images. Accordingly to the historical archive, and I use the word accordingly loosely, this is a construction photo. Does this look like a construction photo to you? I don't know, maybe it is. I mean, maybe they're just digging a big hole and this is the foundation and this is how they did it back then. Although, it's quite puzzling. Well, let's go on to Keith's Theater, again still in Boston, and once again we're going to these incredible, majestic, wondrous theaters, and we've looked at many theaters in many of our city explorations, and here at the Keith Theater in Boston this is no exception. And it seems as though they've got an impressive exterior with a little dome there off to the left, and some other impressive adornments on it with the windows and the little balcony, and who exactly knows what's going on with that tower there in the distance. But again, the real story with the theaters is on the interior, and even though these are very old images and we can't see the coloring, we can at least get a clue of how opulent, impressive, and detailed the interiors of these theaters really were. And again, I find myself lamenting that we don't have theaters that are decorated like this on the inside anymore. And look at how impressive this is with all these columns and arches and all the decorative artistic detailing that went into this all the way up to the ceiling. Once again, this just feels like a structure that's from a completely different world, especially when you look above the theater and you look at all the symbolism. What is this? This is a symbolism. We are in Boston after all. I'll keep my eyes open for Agent Schmecker. But look at the ceiling. Very impressive. And how exactly did they do all that and pull all this off in this time frame? And there's postcards that document this particular theater, along with the images that we have. But it is just quite a tragedy, I think, that we don't have these structures with us anymore. And virtually all these structures that we're looking at were demolished or torn down or altered immeasurably in the 1960s, which I believe is quite a tragedy. And yet, here looking at the ceiling again, I mean, this almost looks like some sort of very advanced portal window. And you can see the extent that the columns went around, indeed with the arches, in the walls leading up to the ceiling. And how exactly did they pull off this decoration when this was originally built? And of course, we won't have any sort of images that show us how they built the interior because we don't want to see that. Well, let's go to the John Wolfe Building, 1895, and now we're in New York City. And this is a rather intriguing building because it seems to stand out a little bit. It may not seem that impressive compared to some of the other structures that we're looking at in this exploration, but there is something uniquely different about it, especially when we consider what we're told about the wondrous skyscrapers that rapidly dotted the New York or Manhattan skyline in the 1890s. And when we look at this John Wolfe Building, we can see that there seems to be clues towards a different sort of construction technique or approach to it. There's something unique about the fact that it almost seems like it's a castle that's been converted into an impressive building. And once again, it almost seems like the top of the building is indeed a castle. We have the portal windows, and we even have what looks to be the gingerbread decoration around each of the windows. Now, what would explain that? Did they have different colored stones? Was it redstone, sandstone, limestone, dyed concrete? You know, who knows what explanation they'd try to float at us. And here we can see how it compares to the other buildings, and even though some of the other buildings are taller, we can see that there is a unique artistic touch with this John Wolfe Building. And once again, this is another unfortunate tragedy that we don't have this building with us anymore. And these are the kind of structures that I really wish I could explore in person. Now, we do supposedly have some construction images of this building, but once again, if scaffolding is all it takes to answer your questions about did we really construct this building, or at least did our current era construct this building, then, you know, that's fine. You can think that if you will. It's just interesting to me that we always have scaffolding photos. Let's go to the New Orleans Cotton Exchange, and this is another building that was lost in the 1960s, and I think of the images that we saw the Cotton Exchange in some other locations, and usually it's just cotton sitting out in the open street for people to walk amongst, but no, here in New Orleans you have a very wondrous and opulent building with columns and pillars and wondrous decorative adornments all over it. Lovely pediments and all the finest of neoclassical architecture. Because remember, according to the official account, neoclassical architecture was brought back in the 1750s when the father of Indiana Jones, or the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Indiana Jones, rediscovered archaeology, or invented archaeology, and then people started adapting these construction styles, you know, without any experience in doing it because it's such an easy thing to do. It was after the Renaissance, after all, but slightly before the Industrial Revolution. So here you have this very impressive series of statues and figures, and a very decorative entryway, because it's exactly what you need for a cotton exchange. I mean, people have to have that feeling of wealth and culture when they go in to do the cotton exchange. And I'll joke a little bit that the building itself is not actually made out of cotton, much like I joked about the lumber building not being made out of lumber in Minneapolis. But I recall looking at this in the New Orleans exploration, and I didn't include it because it was torn down, but I'm glad I can include it in this particular exploration because it's yet another tragedy that this is a wondrous building that we can't visit. And again, there seem to be elements of this building that are far more advanced, and certainly this is not something that we would do today. And we'll be given the usual array of reasons in terms of why we couldn't do it. We have the capability to do it, we just opt not to do it. Yes. And of course you see many wires running all along through here, as we've seen in many of the other older images of New Orleans, and it's always a very impressive and unique city to consider to explore, whether we're looking at its past or you're actually on the ground today. I truly lament the fact, though, that we can't explore the Cotton Exchange. And even the few images that we can find of the interior, it still gives us some clues that there were other wonders on the inside of this building that we can't see, such as the common facet of the pillars being built into the wall. And I really have to ask, what other intriguing architectural detailings did we have on the interior of this building? Well, let's go to Indiana for the Marion County Courthouse, another 1960s casualty, unfortunately. And when you look at this particular structure, you can see that wonderful domes and tall towers, and is this really something that we just consider a courthouse in Indianapolis, Marion County? Very impressive. And why is it that we don't have this structure anymore? This is an intriguing image. I'm trying to figure out exactly what all these wiring represent, or this wireframe represents, or is this just something with the image? I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there when the image was actually taken. I don't know if this is something that was added later, or if this is something that really existed as part of the image. Let me know what you think in the comments. And here we can see after they began to destroy the building, we'll be told it was demolished, but let's be honest, it was destroyed, and how it compared to the wonderful architecture of the 1950s and the 1960s. And of course, they've already begun to pull down the wondrous tower with a tall steeple on it because we needed progress. The interior of this courthouse is completely and totally stunning and beyond the ability of words to convey. Because once again, we see this kind of artistic detailing, and you'd ask the question, why exactly does anybody need this on a courthouse? Do you need to have all these fine figures that are punched into the wall like this, or engraved, or however they were constructed, poured with a geopolymer because you needed to show the authority of the courts if we're going off the mainstream account? Or did this building have a far different purpose, which seems to be quite clear? In the older images, we can see how there was not a structure that would match this building, and certainly there's not a structure today that could match this building. And this is just a county courthouse. Marion County, in Indiana. Not the state capital, although let's be honest, a building like this could very easily be a state capital. It's that wondrous. And yet, once again, we see very fine detailing looking closer at the exterior construction, where we see an array of decorations above every single window and many different designs, including the small little pointy objects that are at the top of the balcony. And what was their original use? And no, I'm not going to give the official decorative name for them because I suspect that they did have a different use, some sort of application of technology. And indeed, every single window seems to have decoration or pediment above it, and we can see that this is when they were tabbing the building for demolition. Another tragedy of the 1960s and another casualty, and unfortunately we do have some images that depict the demolition. Obviously, they wanted to make sure that this was well documented. And again, I have to ask the question, how difficult was it for them to truly demolish this building in the 1960s? How much effort did it take? Well, you can see that we're using our latest, greatest technology. And we do have conflicting accounts of other buildings like this that they wanted to demolish, such as the wondrous City Hall that we have in Philadelphia. And we have conflicting accounts that tell us that it would have been too expensive to demolish it. Well, apparently it was not too expensive in Marion County to demolish this wondrous courthouse. And you have to wonder if the kid there being held by his father or parent figure remembers this. Still, another great tragedy that we lost this building. And looking at that interior image, along with the exterior image, we can see that this was one of the finest structures that we had available in the land. And it matches all the best that we've seen. And it was torn down. And there are many different images that show us the demolition of the building. But again, I wonder how much effort really went into it. I mean, we have a sky crane with a wrecking ball. How long did it take to pull this building down? And then how long did it take to clear the rubble? And then what exactly did they do with the rubble? All questions that I have. Well, in Evansville, in Vanderburgh County, they do still have their old courthouse, and so we can get an idea. And it's more of a good news story that there is a courthouse there that seems to match the authenticity and beauty of the old courthouse that we just looked at in Marion County that was torn down. But looking a little bit closer, we can see some very impressive detailing within this courthouse. And again, I'm asking the question, if this was originally built as a courthouse, why do you need to have all these wondrous decorations in it? Why do you need to have a very impressive dome? And let's be honest, once again, this is not a structure that we would do today. And I'm quite certain that this courthouse is tornado-proof, as they usually tend to be. And looking a little closer, we can see some wondrous decorations. Ah, yes, the symbol of the United States in the 19th century, the Griffin. What else would it be? Well, here's what they have for a current courthouse. That's progress for you. And I guarantee you that was built in the 1960s, and there's nothing like a fine concrete box structure to go and conduct your civil affairs in and have your adjudications read to you, because that's progress. That's the 1960s, and that's the United States. Let's go to New York City again for the Roxy Theater. This lovely structure only existed from 1927 to 1960, 33 years. And yet you're going to find that this is one of the most impressive and stunning theaters that we've looked at. And we've seen some unbelievable beauties when it's come to theaters. Looking at the interior, though, you can just get an idea of how much space they have. And supposedly this was one of the largest circular rugs in the land at that time. I'm not sure about the veracity of that statement, but that was part of the archive that I looked at. Look at the columns. I mean, it's like you're in a gigantic palace when you're in this theater. And this is just supposed to be a theater, or so we're told. And yet here you have the opera, and you can get an idea for how many people actually packed into this theater. Now let's really transport ourselves to the Roxy Theater. Imagine what it would have been like going to see a movie. Imagine going to see Star Wars, and they actually had the opera down there performing the main theme. How would that have been? And then you have all this lovely decoration around you in the walls and the balconies. I mean, this is really an otherworldly experience. Yeah, they try to say that having THX sound makes up for it, but, you know, from my perspective, I think it'd be unreal to actually have the opera there, blaring the theme of Star Wars, or even Star Trek The Motionless Picture. I mean, Jerry Goldsmith's score is pretty great in that. But look at this. All this detailing. Look at these columns. I mean, this really looks like something we'd expect to see in some long forgotten ruin, whether it's in Egypt or Rome or something of the like, and yet we're told the structure only stood for 33 years. Wonderful beauty in every aspect of it. And I'm not sure about the coloring, but when you look at some of the detailing there in the ceiling and all the columns, and I would just love to see some images that show the construction of this theater. And there's a lot of associations that still exist with this theater, but it's been forgotten in a lot of respects, unfortunately. Just the size and immensity of it, and the ability to have all these people watch a film, because that's what we're told it was designed for. This was the golden age of cinema. And yes, you have to build a palace on the inside so people can appreciate it. We do apparently have a single perspective diagram, because what else would it be, that shows us the layout of this impressive theater. And I'll be sure to include this on the channel's Reddit page, because I'm sure others would like to see this diagram and at least get an idea from one perspective as how this theater was laid out. But just imagine what kind of cinematic experience this must have been, having the opera really play the soundtrack. Oh, and they had an organ too, because, you know, well, why not? You have all these old stadiums that had organs, so of course when you built the most stunning movie theater in the late 1920s, when it was apparently very easy and practical to do, you needed to have an organ because the orchestra wasn't enough. It just completely blows my mind that this is what we had. And you can get an idea for the size of this theater, and what exactly is the purpose of all this on the ceiling? It's all just decoration? Or did it have some other purpose? Was there some other original intention behind the construction of this impressive theater? Because we really haven't seen anything quite like this. Even this office that was in this theater is very well detailed and decorated, from the ceiling and the very impressive fireplace, because, you know, it's just what you need. You need a very impressive fireplace in your office in a movie theater. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Yeah, we'll just drop any questions beyond that. And here in this image, you can just get an idea of the size of the main lobby and the entryway. And again, you can see some of the decorative detailing that went into these very large columns. And you can get a sense of scale with all these individuals. And of course, on the large circular rug. And what exactly is going on with that symbol right there above the main entryway? What exactly do we have in the detailing with this image? What do you think these symbols represent? Or do you think this was just something that they decided to incorporate to really give the grand cinematic experience in the late 1920s? Again, let me know in the comments. I'm interested to hear what you have to say, because a lot of these images are quite baffling in many different ways. And even in this postcard here, we can again see the detailing and the amazing indoor space that they had for all these people to view cinema, and then even the pit for the orchestra to perform. I just, again, think that would be so amazing to have that experience. And here we have an exterior photo, and you can see the very old cars, and yet at the same time, the front facade of the theater, which is very impressive with detailing as well. I mean, we've seen some other theaters that you don't really have it on the outside so much. It's all in the interior, but here, the Roxy Theater, they had it on the outside, they had it on the inside. It was the complete and total package. And even in other postcards, we can just get an idea for how large it really was. And if anybody can find any sort of construction images, and I'm not as concerned about the veracity, I just want to see what we're calling as construction images of the Roxy Theater, I would be delighted to see them, because for all the theaters that we've seen, this is definitely one of the very best ones. And it just gives you an idea of all this detail that they had to build this. I mean, this just feels like this is a science fiction film that you're watching. But no, we're told this is a real theater that we had, and it was in the distant past. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Maybe it's not supposed to. Unfortunately, we do have this photo that shows the destruction of the Roxy Theater, again in the 1960s, again as part of the Urban Renewal program. And it almost seems as though it's an occasion for some sort of strange celebration. And one has to question that for a variety of reasons. I mean, why would we ever allow ourselves to lose a structure like this? Oh, well, there's a TGI Fridays there now in the same location, so get yourself some less than stellar chicken wings. Okay, enough of that. Well, let's go to the Fox Theater in San Francisco, and this one was up from 1929 to 1963. And we've looked at several Fox theaters before in our explorations in many other cities, from Atlanta to St. Louis and others. And yet, I dare say we're about to see one of the most stunning Fox theaters ever. Again, it has quite a detailed exterior, but then the interior of this Fox theater is truly something from a completely different plane of existence, and I don't know how else to describe it. Now, we're looking at the older photos first, but it starts to give you some clues in terms of how detailed this Fox theater really was. So again, same questions. How did they do it? What kind of logistics were involved? What were the exact construction techniques? Because again, you feel like you're in some sort of futuristic science fiction palace when you look at these columns, and you look at all the detailing that went up into the ceiling, and all this decoration. How much effort was really put into this, into establishing this? And here, looking at the seating for the audience. I mean, again, imagine seeing any sort of show, whether it's a play, a musical, or, again, even an actual film in a theater like this. But I mean, look at these steps and these very impressive columns. And again, we have these almost futuristic symbols. And I just don't even know how to describe all these decorations that we have. What's the purpose behind all of it? Was this really just to get everybody in the film-going mood when they walked into this Fox Theater in San Francisco? And I think this is probably the most stunning photo of all when you see this particular lobby. Again, we have columns, not pillars, that are integrated into the walls with this very impressive and ornate detail. And this coloring, it almost feels like we're looking at a palace of gold. All for a theater. Well, we go back to Minneapolis to look at the Metropolitan Building, 1890 to 1961. And this is considered one of the most significant architectural achievements in Minneapolis, and we're told that this was constructed in 1890. And you might recall from our exploration of Minneapolis that the city was growing very fast at the time. And again, we have yet another skyscraper that seems to be a skyscraper that's converted into a castle, or a castle that's converted into a skyscraper, or some sort of strange hybrid of design. And I have to say, looking at this Metropolitan Building, or Northwestern Guarantee Loan Building, as it was originally known as, yeah, that's a name that just rolls right off the tongue, you get the impression of, again, some sort of futuristic structure that we would never build today or attempt to build today. But we're told it was done in the 1890s in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Because you might recall the weather there is very generous this time of year, and it's very easy to build buildings like this. Although, oddly enough, they're actually having a mild winter in Minneapolis right now. Here we have the guarantee loan sign on the front of it. Yes, doesn't that just look as wondrous as the rest of the building? But Look at all the little symbols there. And again, I'm asking, what exactly is this building constructed out of? Because unfortunately, we no longer have this building to go examine in person, and there's probably a very definitive reason for that. Of course, we'll be told it was because of the urban renewal in the 1960s, and how could you possibly leave an eyesore like this standing in a beautiful city like Minneapolis when things were really rolling along in the 1960s? Yeah, that's right, the Metrodome. There's no way you could compare a building like this to the Metrodome. Yes, I'm being very sarcastic. But that's okay, they've moved on from the Metrodome. The interior, though, is, again, something that sort of reminds me of another science fiction film, because you don't see interiors like this on our modern buildings. We got lots of cubicles for you, we got lots of plaid, boring gray walls, and we've got some very simple elevators. But here you have a series of balconies and an interior that goes all the way to the top of the building. And then we can see, again, columns that are integrated in the walls. So 1890, no problem. Minneapolis, they could do it. There had to be some sort of stunning architect who was involved with the construction of this building. That's the explanation will be given. And again, 1890 science fiction, just looking at this building. For some reason, I'm kind of reminded of the Bradbury building, which was the building that they filmed Blade Runner, the first Blade Runner film. I'm not referring to 2049. Not that I have anything against Denis Villeneuve, but I just prefer the original film. I mean, you could just have easily filmed that final duel between Deckard and Roy Batty, the replicant, here in this building, if it still stood, if it actually survived the urban renewal of the 1960s, because like the Bradbury building, this looks even more advanced. This looks even more futuristic, and this looks like it would be a wonderful set location for a science fiction film. And again, you can see in all the detailing here with the hand railing and the columns and everything else that there's just something about this building that seems to be far beyond the 1890s and what we'd expect would be our capabilities to do, especially in a place like Minneapolis, Minnesota. And remember, the city really wasn't that old yet in 1890. But again, it was just the pioneering experience. There were no safety standards involved at that time. They had artisans and craftsmen who could do anything. And even though they had an abundance of lumber in Minneapolis, it seems that they had an abundance of any other material that they needed. Whatever the material that this building was actually constructed out of. And here, just looking at this wide shot to give you an idea of how the interior looks and why it seems to be so advanced and so far ahead of its time. Again, another wondrous, impressive structure that I dare say defies our abilities to replicate today. I would be really impressed if we could build anything like this building today. Here, looking down in the series of floors. I mean, there's just something that seems to be from another realm when we consider this sort of building. A completely different approach and a different mentality. Well, we always have an explanation for how this was done. And here we have the entryway. Strangely enough, we see some familiar symbols. And there we have the designation of this being the Metropolitan Building, of course, because what else would it be? And I'm always fascinated, though, by what exactly is this stone? Because, we'll be given the usual explanation that there were processes that were used to make the stone look aged as soon as they put it up in the 1890s when they called it the Northwestern Guarantee Loan Building. Why on earth would you ever call anything a Northwestern Guarantee Loan Building? Oh, because it was a bank and they put up the money for it. Well, I decided to look up the architect for this particular building because I was intrigued. And guess what I found out? That's right, E. Townsend Mix. It's not enough that he architected half the buildings in Milwaukee, he did the state capitol of Kansas and all these other buildings, and a random courthouse in Mantorville, Minnesota. He also did the Northwestern Guarantee Loan Building in Minneapolis because the guy just didn't have enough projects under his belt. E. Townsend Mix, those architects. And let's not forget his great mentor, Sidney Mason Stone. Yes, that's actually the guy's name. Now, who was Sidney Mason Stone's mentor? M. Bison Constructor? Yes, that's how you pronounce it. M. Bison Constructor. Bears a striking resemblance to Raul Julia. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.